the ever-shifting landscape of global affairs, moments of intensity and complexity often converge to define our times. From the bustling streets of New York to the embattled corridors of power in the Middle East, the world stage is alive with the drama of political maneuvering and social upheaval. In recent days, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's bold declaration that Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah with or without a ceasefire deal echoes through the halls of history as tensions escalate. The specter of conflict looms large as Netanyahu's unwavering resolve clashes with international pleas for restraint. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the heart of academia pulsates with fervor as pro-Palestinian protesters storm the bastions of higher learning, such as Fordham University, Portland State University, and UCLA, demanding justice and accountability in the face of global scrutiny. And at Columbia University, pro-Palestinian student protesters stormed the same campus building that once housed the voices of racial justice and anti-Vietnam voices in the 1960s. What unfolded was a scene of defiance, of demands, and of a new generation carving its mark on the halls of power. As the night sky draped over New York City, these students stood resolute, declaring, "We will not leave until Columbia meets every one of their demands." Their call reverberated through Hamilton Hall, demanding divestment from Israel, transparency in investments, and protection for all who dare to raise their voices. But this isn't just a moment in time. It's a thread woven into the tapestry of history, echoing the chants of past movements while forging a path uniquely their own. Numerous individuals have reflected on the anti-Vietnam War protests that engulfed Columbia University's campus, contending that these tumultuous events significantly bolstered the political standing of figures on the right, such as Richard Nixon. They emphasize that if history were to echo itself, the current wave of protests at Columbia University and across American colleges can ultimately serve to advance the political fortunes of Donald Trump in the upcoming fall. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken is intensifying pressure on Hamas for an immediate ceasefire agreement with Israel as the conflict in Gaza enters its 7th month. Blinken's latest diplomatic efforts, including meetings with Israeli leaders, aim to broker a deal to prevent an Israeli offensive in Rafah, where over 1.4 million Palestinians seek refuge. Despite prolonged negotiations, Hamas insists on the unconditional release of all hostages as a prerequisite for halting hostilities and withdrawing Israeli troops from Gaza. With tensions mounting, urgency grows for a breakthrough to avert further escalation. At a time like this, I'm so glad to be joined by Dr. Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, a beacon of wisdom, one of the leading minds of our time in the realm of global diplomacy and foreign policy. He has a wealth of experience navigating the treacherous waters of international relations. Dr. Haass, thanks for being part of the Political Mic.
Mr. Taylor, Mike, good to be back with you.
So, Dr. Haass, how do you perceive the parallels that folks are making between the campus unrest of the 1960s, particularly 1968, the spring of 1968, and the current wave of protests, particularly regarding their potential political implications?
Look, I don't see a lot of parallels. The United States is not at war. Obviously, we've been, mostly supportive of Israel, but historically, we've also been quite supportive of Palestinians. I think also, the 68 protests had something to do in the long run with influencing the American debate about Vietnam, maybe. I think the real thing that influenced the American debate was less the protest than the lack of success of the policy. And essentially, during the Nixon administration, the president lost the country, lost the Congress. So I don't think I think that in that sense, the protests were reflective of that. As you said in your run-up, they may have actually helped Nixon's political fortunes. The 68 convention certainly hurt the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey. Sorry, Mike, but I don't see where these protests do anything whatsoever to help the people of Gaza. There's real issues involved with what Israel's doing. These protests are not going to affect things one iota. Also, a lot of the people protesting haven't done their homework. Let's be blunt. They haven't studied the history of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I don't see them complaining about Hamas rule. What has Hamas done over the last 20 years? It can't all be attributed to what Israel has done. Also, some of the selectivity, shall we say, of their indignation rubs me wrong. I don't see too many of them out protesting what Russia's done in Ukraine, or we can go around the world, what's going on in any number of other places. So, pardon me for not being moved. And I think there's also an issue of the policy, and then there's the behavior. What I see on these protests, what about the rights of other students?
Right.
What about the right to take final exams or go to commencement? or not be intimidated or not to have to walk through these encampments. And how would a lot of these kids feel? Let's be really blunt at the risk of being awkward here. Sorry to go on so long. Forgive me.
No,
But okay, so these people are protesting nominally to help in favor of Palestinians against Israel. Let's just put that aside. Would these schools, would these students feel just as empowered if people were protesting against affirmative action? Or if people were out there saying good things, about groups that are clearly racist? I think there's some double standards here. Let me just put that out there at the risk of getting into uncomfortable areas. So again, my enthusiasm for what I see going on with the protests is low. What I really wish were happening, I really wish that people were using this as an opportunity to get smarter and get more informed. Why aren't there more teach-ins? I see sit-ins. I'm not seeing a lot of teach-ins. Why aren't campuses using this as a real chance to get up to speed, to learn the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? That to me would be worthwhile.
I agree with you, Dr. Haass. There is a lack of an understanding of the fact that the United States has certain obligations. For instance, Memorandum of Understanding. We give $3.8 billion annually to Israel for their defense systems. Is it a realistic goal for these protesters to say sever ties with Israel in light of the fact that the United States still has these obligations to make?
No, it's not just obligations. I think it would be strategically and morally wrong to sever ties with Israel. Israel faces real threats, including from Iran, including from Hezbollah, including from Hamas, and so forth. So the real question, though, is should there be any conditions attached to any of the arms we're giving Israel? And I'm prepared to argue, yes. I don't think certain types of armaments ought to be used in situations where the likelihood of causing all sorts of civilian casualties is high. That, to me, is a serious conversation. And that's something the administration, I would argue, should consider seriously. But to cut off, all the aid is that's not seriousness. That's just empty.
Yeah, and there's a lack of understanding of history, like you had alluded to earlier. This energy that we're seeing, I'm wondering if it's going to be sustained in the summer months and likely cause chaos on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, the same way that the '68 convention in Chicago, ironically, it's also going to be in Chicago this year, caused Hubert Humphrey's nomination to have this stain on it.
You know what, Mike? The one person who's hoping it does is named Donald Trump. And so I just wish some of the people out there doing this were thinking it through and saying, do I necessarily want to hurt Joe Biden, whatever my frustrations are with him and Kamala Harris? Do I want to hurt them and help Donald Trump and whoever he chooses as his running mate? Have any of them stopped to think for maybe 30 seconds about what Donald Trump's policy was towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during the 4 years he was president? And do they seriously believe his policies would be better for Palestinians than Joe Biden's policies? Because what they're going to do, again, is increase the likelihood he will be the next president of the United States. They may think that's swell, but they ought to be mindful of the likely consequences of what they're doing.
President Biden was pressed by reporters today if any of this would change his stance in terms of foreign policy, and he bluntly said no, it would not. Given your experience in international relations, how do you assess the impact of this domestic unrest and his response to it? Do you think that this was a mistake for President Biden to say that it has not moved him?
One has the virtue of being true. It's not going to move him. The fact that a couple of thousand protesters are protesting, they're not arguing policy in any serious way. There's nothing thoughtful about it. Like again, I disagree with aspects of the Biden administration policy, but kids sitting in tents at Columbia University are not going to move the president or the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. Have them put forth serious arguments. That's like you want to be involved, you want to have influence, then get serious. But the protests against college authorities and disrupting college life, how is that going to change policy? The president's absolutely right. This is irrelevant what's going on. But if people want to have a serious conversation about policy, sure, there are things to disagree with. I think for what it's worth, I've been disagreeing with large aspects of the administration policy over the last nearly seven months now. But the people sitting in tents on campuses, that's not serious.
Yeah. And drawing from your experience navigating turbulent periods in American history, how would you advise the Biden administration in handling the current situation with unrest on college campuses, considering the potential political ramifications?
It's not their job. I would basically say it's up to school authorities to do their job, to show leadership, to set clear rules on campus. Yes, protect rights of free speech, but free speech is not an absolute. Plus, free speech at times conflicts with other rights. So, college leaders, presidents, and their administrations have to navigate the trade-offs, the rights of other students and so forth, the rights of parents to come to a commencement and hear a speaker rather than having the speaker drowned out. So university presidents and others need to set the rules and enforce them. And where they don't have the means to enforce them, I think it's totally legit to call in law enforcement. And there ought to be no place on these campuses for people who aren't part of the college or university community. We don't need outsiders coming in to stir the pot. What the president ought to focus on is not this. I think he's right to say it's not going to change him, but he ought to focus on the policy. And I think there are legitimate areas to debate about what the president's saying in public, whether he should articulate a more developed position about Palestinian political aspirations, whether the United States should be doing more to rein in Israeli settlement activity, whether the United States could be doing more to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, whether we ought to be putting specific limits on how certain weapon systems could be used. That's the stuff of policy, and that's what the president should be focusing on. That's what his critics should be focusing on. But the protests have become an end in themselves. These are not serious policy discussions. They simply become protests against university authorities.
You came out with a wonderful work, the Bill of Obligations, 10 Habits of Good Citizens. What are some of the habits in that book that you wish that these students would adopt right now?
Well, the first of the obligations is one I wish they would adopt, which is being informed. A lot of them jump directly to the second obligation, which is to get involved. But to get involved without being informed is a decidedly mixed blessing. So the first thing I would say is get much better informed about the history, about the issues. I also wish they would be open to compromise. I'd like them to be, shall we say, far, far, far more civil. That they ought to totally rule out any violence. There's no place for political violence in America, whether it's at UCLA or on January 6th. That's not the American way. So there's things they can do and should do very differently.
How do you assess the potential consequences, Dr. Haass, of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration to invade Rafah regardless of a ceasefire deal on regional stability and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Look, a lot depends upon whether he means it or he's certainly using it as leverage. But let's say he means it. A big question is timing. And I believe that there's still time for a hostage and prisoner exchange deal to materialize if Hamas is serious about it. I'm not sure they are. And then if Israel does use force in Rafah, and I think at some point they are likely to, the real question is how do they use force? Do they use it again really large? Do they use large sorts of bombs? Do they do tactics in such a way as to cause large numbers of civilian casualties? Or do they do something, Mike, that's much more calibrated, much more discriminating, much more careful? So to me, the bigger question is not whether Israel goes into Rafah, it's when, and even more how. How does it, above all, how does it use military force? Who does it target? What kind of efforts do they take in order to avoid civilian casualties? Those to me are the immediate questions. And afterwards is what do they do the day after? That question has been out there now for what, 7 months? Just say Israel further weakens Hamas. Okay, what then? What is Israel going to try to do in the way of governance? What is Israel prepared to do so 5 years from now we don't have a replay of that? And I don't see any answers coming out of this Israeli government as to what would come after whatever type of military effort they undertake.
President Biden has been really trying to find this balance between condemning what happened on October 7th and providing security and assistance to Israel, and also taking a stance against indiscriminate bombing and Gaza, and being sympathetic to those who are innocently in the crosshairs of this conflict. Considering the Biden administration's urging against the full invasion of Rafah without a specific plan to prevent civilian casualties, what diplomatic strategies could be employed to de-escalate tensions and advance peace negotiations in the region?
Well, they're trying to do it with the hostage for prisoner for temporary ceasefire negotiations. That's one thing. They're urging the Israelis not to go into Rafah. That's a second thing. They're talking to the Saudis and others about making a proposal to Israel that, among other things, would say, we will normalize relations with you, but only if you offer the Palestinians something meaningful in the way of a political path that over time could realize at least some of their legitimate aspirations. So things like that, I think, all make sense.
Anthony Blinken made an announcement of a planned visit of Rafah, which coincided with the announcement by Netanyahu that they're going to invade Rafah. Does this planned visit underscore the urgency of truce talks? And how does diplomatic engagements like these effectively address the complexities of the conflict?
Look, talks have been going on for 7 months about hostage release, prisoner releases, and truces of various duration. So and again, that's been going on, and that'll continue to go on. In the meantime, though, you have the question still of Hamas's presence in Gaza. This Israeli government at some point will go after it. And again, to me, the bigger question is when, as I said, how they do it, what care they take, and more important, what accompanies it. At the end of the day, let me just make a point that I would love to see Hamas defeated. I think Hamas is truly a force for evil. I think Hamas does not care whatsoever about the plight of the Palestinian people. They had 20 years to do something for the Palestinian people, and they totally failed. So let's not romanticize Hamas. The real question, again, though, is you can't beat something with nothing. You can hurt Hamas using physical force, using the military, but you can't defeat it with military force alone. You can only defeat it if you offer Palestinians an alternative political path that basically says, if you give up violence, you give up killing Israelis, but you are prepared to coexist with them peacefully, then here's the sort of thing that could one day be yours. They won't get everything they want, but they'll get a hell of a lot more of what they want if they rule out violence and they ultimately sit down and talk realistically with Israelis. But Israel has to be encouraged to put that on the table. We have to put some of those ideas on the table. Again, a one-dimensional military policy is not going to succeed in sidelining Hamas.
How might the prospect of a full-scale invasion of Rafah impact broader geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East, particularly in relation to regional alliances and security arrangements?
What it will do is set back Arab normalization with Israel. It'll make American cooperation with Arab countries more difficult. But most of the Arab countries, as well as the United States, as well as Israel, are worried fundamentally about Iran, both directly and its proxies. So sooner or later, that cooperation will return. We saw the cooperation a few weeks ago when Iran shot the missiles at Israel and the drones at Israel, and we saw the Arab countries work with the United States and Israel to intercept them. So I think the basic lines in the Middle East are pretty clear against Iran, against Iran's proxies, against terrorism. The question is, though, for how long will what Israel is doing vis-a-vis the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, for how long will that be an impediment to what you might call the emergence of a new regional architecture? That's why, again, I think what Israel's doing not only won't succeed in Gaza, I think it's getting in the way of something that's very much in Israel's interest, which is forging this new level of cooperation with the Arab countries. So I hope the Israelis come to see things differently. I hope they come to see things differently sooner rather than later.
As Secretary Blinken applies pressure on Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposal, what diplomatic strategies could be employed to bridge the gap between Hamas's demands and Israel's objectives?
I'm not sure there's, not every question has an answer. There's look, they've been talking for quite some time about this many hostages and this many political prisoners linked to this thing with a truce and with food. So in negotiations, Mike, what rarely is critical funnily enough, is the content of the deal. Here, the contours of the deal is pretty much out there. The real question is whether the parties are willing and able to accept it. And at the moment, I think there's real questions on both sides, but particularly about Hamas. We don't know how many hostages are still alive, and we don't know if Hamas is going to agree to any realistic deal. If they keep insisting that they will only sign a deal and allow hostages to go if Israel signs a permanent ceasefire and every last Israeli soldier leaves Gaza, then we're not going to have a deal. So that's not on Secretary Blinken. It's not as though he can tweak the deal and get from here to an agreement. That just tells me that Hamas is not serious about wanting a deal.
And that seemed to remind me of what former Secretary Panetta said on the show. You have a lot of kids calling for a ceasefire, a lot of protesters saying we need a ceasefire now, but they're not understanding the other factors at play, because you need to be able to get Hamas and Israel to agree to such a thing. Despite that, the Biden administration seems to have been a little responsive because they've been advocating for a temporary ceasefire. And then you get Secretary Blinken asserting that the time is now for a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. So given the complexities of the situation and the resistance from both sides, how do you interpret this administration's decision to assert the time is now for a ceasefire?
They want to see a temporary ceasefire. They want to see as many hostages as possible get returned. It's that simple. They're not supporting a permanent ceasefire. They understand that Israel still faces a threat from Hamas. That what happened on October 7th happened. So the administration's trying to get food into Gaza through the airdrops, through building a pier. They're pressuring Israel to allow more food in. They want a hostage deal. They're willing to release get Palestinian prisoners released. So the administration's on it. But again, anytime you try to mediate a conflict, and I've been involved in many, including the Middle East, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, India, Pakistan, you can't control the situation. The parties themselves have to decide what they're prepared to do. So the United States is urging certain things on Israel and Hamas. We're obviously talking to Qatar and others who have influence over Hamas, but we're not pulling the strings here. All we can do is make the case that people make certain compromises, make certain commitments. But at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to decide.
After months of debate, of course, Congress finally passed a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine. And this legislation, of course, gives the president nearly everything he wanted, which is surprising given the drama that took place in the Republican House caucus. And so the new legislation would bring the United States' total commitment to the Ukraine conflict against Russia to $175 billion. In the package is included $25.7 billion specifically for military equipment for Ukraine. You had Zelensky saying that this would give Ukrainians a chance to turn the tide against Putin and his regime. How do you assess this bill in light of the fact that it took so long to finally get passed?
What it will do, is one of those better late than never. What it will do is give Ukraine greater capacity to stand firm, to push back against Russian aggression. Russia will continue to throw lots of soldiers, lots of ammunition, lots of equipment against Ukraine. But I think this levels the playing field. Is it enough for Ukraine to go liberate a lot of land? No. Will it allow Ukraine to attack some targets deep within Russia or Russia-occupied Ukraine? Absolutely. But it's not going to turn the tide. What it will do is, I think, or slow Russia's momentum. It'll buy time for Ukraine, and then we'll have to see, because Ukraine's going to need future shipments of military. So once this 61 billion is used up, they're going to need another 61 billion and another 61 billion. And that's the only way that ultimately, I think, Putin may conclude the time is not on his side. So he has to ultimately be convinced that the West has staying power and that we are prepared to help Ukraine for as long as it takes. And if and when Putin comes to realize that, then I think it sets the stage potentially for some type of, not for peace, but maybe for some kind of ceasefire.
Is Putin already at work trying to undermine democracy through the internet like he did in 2016?
Sure. Yeah, he does it. Others do it. By the way, we're pretty good at it without his help. So, yeah, the Russians are, doing things on social media and elsewhere. But even if all of that went away, I think we actually pose some pretty serious problems to ourselves.
And Secretary Blinken's warning to China regarding its support for Russia's defense
Yeah.
industry. That's a significant escalation in the U.S. China relationship. How do you assess the potential impact of imposing sanctions on Chinese entities, and what broader implications does this move have for the global balance of power?
Well, hopefully, what the United States is saying and threatening will persuade China to pull back. China, as best I can tell, is not sending arms to Russia, but they're sending them the ability to produce arms. A lot of the defense industrial base. They ought not to be doing it. It's in violation of all sorts of the sanctions that were put in place. So we ought to make it very clear to China about the impact this will have on our relationship, and whether it's sanctions that we would impose, or we would increase certain help to places China doesn't want us to increase help to, like Taiwan. We should look at it, but China needs to understand that this is truly in the unacceptable department, that we have made a major commitment to Ukraine on behalf of the rule of law, to resist aggression. And what China does and doesn't do here will have an enormous impact on the U.S.-Chinese relationship. And China cares about this relationship. It doesn't want to see all sorts of new controls on investment and trade. So they ought to understand the linkage between what it is they do to help Russia and the U.S.-Chinese relationship.
And despite efforts to stabilize the U.S.-Chinese relationship, President Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping in November, tensions seem to have been persistent over issues such as trade, Taiwan, and territorial disputes in the South China Sea. How can the Biden administration effectively address these key irritants while maintaining a constructive dialogue with Beijing?
Well, the answer is you maintain a dialogue between Washington and Beijing. You're not going to resolve or eliminate the differences over Taiwan or the South China Sea and so forth, but hopefully you avoid mistakes. You avoid incidents or accidents spilling out of control. That's why the United States was so wanted to reestablish the military-to-military communications channel. You make it very clear about what we were just discussing, what would be the consequences or implications of certain types of behaviors, and therefore you hope you discourage those behaviors that would be consequential in the wrong sort of way. So again, this is a relationship to be managed. You're not going to solve these differences. And what you basically want to say is, if you do things we like or don't do things we don't like, here's the positives that might come your way economically or what have you. But on the other hand, if you do things that we have real problems with, here's the price you're going to pay for it. And at the end of the day, China is a sovereign country. It'll make up its mind what it wants to do vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis the Philippines and the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Russia. But what we want them to do is to make those decisions fully mindful of what would be the consequences in their relationship with us. And hopefully then that'll discourage them from doing things that we see counterproductive.
And my last question, Dr. Haass, drawing from historical precedents, such as the Iraq War, what lessons should policymakers learn to avoid repeating past mistakes and promote stability in the Middle East and beyond?
It's a last question, and it's a big question. Look, you're not going to solve the Middle East, Mike. But there are things the United States can do to promote diplomatic progress. We can promote deterrence by who we help. The Middle East it's like California, in the sense that you've got all these fault lines, and earthquakes can erupt at any moment. That's just a fact of life. So you want to strengthen your friends, and you want to find ways to discourage your adversaries from doing dangerous things. You want to keep open lines of communication. Want to be careful about assumptions that can get you into trouble. But there's no magic recipe or formula here. The definition of success can't be to turn the Middle East into Switzerland. Ain't going to happen. What you basically want to do is create conditions where bad or imperfect situations don't get much worse. And if you can make things better, and at times, through negotiations, we have made things better. Peace between Egypt and Israel, peace between Jordan and Israel, peace between Bahrain and other countries, and Israel, Morocco and Israel. We've had, is the Oslo agreements between Israelis and Palestinians. We've had diplomatic successes. So, history doesn't tell you to be, history doesn't teach despair. History teaches possibility. And that's what we have to work towards.
Well, Dr. Haass, it's always a pleasure to have you and to glean from your wisdom on the show. Thank you so much for what you brought to the Political Mic today.
Thanks, my friend. Good to be back with you, Mike. You take care of yourself.
You too, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
With that being said, that's going to conclude this episode of the Political Mic. Thanks for tuning in.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.